The Why, What, and Who. Introduction to the Naval War of 1812 Illustrated. A production of the American Society of Marine Artists. Why the war is relevant to the world now, 200 years later. What was it all about? And who are the real winners? Why 1812 is relevant today. The first self-awareness as a nation-state for both the Americans and Canadians is rooted in the War of 1812. The nationalism that resulted from the war became the foundation for manifest destiny in America and the eventual independence for Canada in 1867 and the westward expansion of both countries. On the anvil of war and the conflicts leading up to and during the War of 1812, the maritime forces of the young American nation, the Navy, the Marines, and the predecessor to the Coast Guard, the Revenue Cutter Service, were hammered into the nuclei of what would become 2 centuries later the most powerful maritime force the world has ever known. A force for global good in keeping international sea lanes open, free, and the global economy functioning. The War of 1812 taught Americans the hard way the importance of having and maintaining strong maritime forces. When the war was over, they demonstrated they had learned their lesson by increasing naval expenditures to build a fleet of capital ships. The only time in American history this ever happened. What was it all about? In order to understand why the War of 1812 happened, one has to go back over 20 years before the war to find its root cause. A revolution in France that plunged Europe into 2 decades of the most severe fighting the world had ever experienced, and which made it very difficult, and in the end impossible, for the United States, under its new Constitution and federal government, to maintain its neutrality and not become entangled in the death struggle between Britain and France and their allies. In the eyes of the protagonists, trading with one camp made even a neutral an enemy of the other. This led America to war first with the French and then with the British. But during these prologue years leading up to the War of 1812, the Barbary states along the North African coast posed another very real threat to American maritime interests in the Mediterranean. This, in fact, led the newly created Congress to authorize the construction of a number of remarkable frigates that were first used against the French in the Quasi-War of 1798 to 1800, and then in the First Barbary War, 1801 to 1805. These naval conflicts with the French and the Barbary states provided the newly created Navy, Marines, and Revenue Cutter Service, the predecessor to the Coast Guard, with invaluable experience going into the War of 1812 with Great Britain. But continued refusal by the British to honor American right to free trade as a neutral, and its aggressive campaign to impress thousands of American sailors into the Royal Navy to address its severe manpower shortages, plus the perception by some Americans on the frontier that the British were actively supporting Native Americans in their resistance to American westward expansion, led to the war in June 1812. Who are the real winners? The Naval War of 1812 Illustrated follows the conflict into its 3 principal theaters. First, the oceans of blue water. Second, the Great Lakes and waters along the northern border of the United States. And third, the brown waters of American coastal bays, estuaries, rivers, and sounds. The War on Blue Water. In the opening months of the war, it is clear that the U.S. Navy bested the Royal Navy on blue water. The Royal Navy had centuries of naval experience and rarely, very rarely, lost a one-on-one naval engagement of ships of equal rating. Therefore, is it not evident that America was the winner when, in such engagements, it captured or sunk 5 British warships in a row? And was it not all the more remarkable performance when a navy of no more than a couple dozen ships delivered such blows to one with a fleet of over 600? But what happened when the Napoleonic Wars ended in early 1814 and the British could show their true strength by redeploying men and ships to deal with these troublesome Americans? How effective was their blockade of American ports? Were some American ships able to run it? Who were the winners and losers of those situations? War on the Lakes. The second theater of the war was along the northern border of the United States, naturally defined by a necklace of lakes connected by a string of rivers. Were not the British in North America, the Canadians, the winners early on, when they not only stopped an American invading army, but also captured it on American soil? This resulted in part from the fact that the British controlled the Great Lakes. The first arms race in the history of the young republic occurred there, as Americans sought to take naval control along that border. Who won that arms race on Lake Ontario? Or was it just a draw, and more of a battle of the carpenters than a naval contest? On Lake Erie, in spite of the seesaw activity of the respective armies across the border, was it not, in the end, the American naval victory on Lake Erie that determined the outcome? Or was it the Battle of Plattsburgh on Lake Champlain when the American Navy defeated the Royal Navy and thereby prevented a massive British army, battle-hardened in the Napoleonic Wars, from invading the United States straight down the Hudson Valley? As the thousands of British retreated back to Montreal, is there any doubt who was the winner? But in the end, weren't the Canadians, whom the Americans outnumbered 10-1, the real winners? For they successfully defended their lands from Yankee aggression. Who were the biggest losers? Were they not the Native Americans whose federation and alliances disintegrated when their great leader Tecumseh was killed in battle, and when the British no longer could nor wanted to arm them with guns and ammunition, and thus they could no longer effectively stop the westward expansion by American settlers into their lands? The War on Brown Water. The War on Brown Water examines 3 areas of activity: the coast of Maine, Long Island Sound, and the Chesapeake Bay, before turning to the last major event of the war, the Battle of New Orleans. Is there any doubt that the British clearly won control over the whole eastern half of the Maine coastline and kept it until the war was over? Did the Americans even try to recover it? Although in Long Island Sound, the British bombarded towns, burned fleets, captured ships, and successfully blockaded shipping for the balance of the war, did they win? Or did the scrappy local Americans, who prevented the British from establishing a base of operations like they did in Maine and in the Chesapeake Bay? By the summer of 1814, the British were moving significant military resources from Europe to finish off the Americans, who were already greatly weakened by the economic impact of the ever-tightening British blockade. Americans in the Chesapeake Bay took a real beating. This was a much more ugly form of warfare, one the British insisted they learned earlier from the Americans, when they burned whole towns and drove residents out into the dead of winter empty-handed along the northern border. After a summer of capturing ships and burning, bombarding, and blockading towns in the bay, the British took Washington and burned the public buildings. Was this not a British victory? On the other hand, the Americans successfully defended Baltimore, and the British retreated from the bay within days of failing to subdue Fort McHenry that protected Baltimore. In spite of all the pain and suffering, who was left in control? A clear victory, no? And if that was not, how can anyone argue that the next and final major battle in New Orleans was not only a victory for the Americans, but one of the most humiliating defeats for the British, who had put into the battle troops who had defeated Napoleon and the armies of Europe? Yet, when the dust settled, Was not the biggest victory for the Americans the Peace Treaty of Ghent? Through brilliant negotiation and a great deal of good fortune and luck, the Americans, amazingly, were left with what they had when the war began. Months before the war ended, the Americans had nearly gone bankrupt as a result of the British blockade and economic paralysis. Nonetheless, after the war, Americans came to think they had indeed won the war. This was largely because of the singular victories by the American Navy, Marines, and revenue cuttermen early in the war, and the naval victories on the lakes coupled with the lopsided and very colorfully American victory in New Orleans. There, General Andrew Jackson had hammered together a fighting force of pirates, freed slaves, Native Americans, Cajuns, riflemen from the hills of Tennessee and Kentucky, local militia, and men from the U.S. Army and U.S. Navy, and took on the world's most formidable military force, and won. And the sudden economic turnaround after the war, leading to the era of good feeling, helped everyone think what they wanted to think about what just happened. In the perspective of time, of 2 centuries later, the clear winner in the War of 1812 is the world today. What grew out of the Tri-Party War was an ever-strengthening alliance of the same 3 parties: the United States, the Dominion of Canada, and the United Kingdom. Over the intervening 2 centuries, especially during the 20th century and early 21st, this alliance has been at the core of international forces that have fought wars to defend freedom and democracy and kept the sea lanes free and open to international commerce of all nations. A fundamentally important fact when 70% of the globe is covered by water, 80% of its people live near the water, and 90% of its commerce travels on water. To find the answers to these and other questions about this important chapter in American and Canadian history, view the 5 parts of the Naval War of 1812 Illustrated as they become available on this website. This is a production of the American Society of Marine Artists, the nation's leading professional, educational, not-for-profit marine art organization, in conjunction with other leading national and international institutions, museums, and historical societies. Part 1, the Prologue to War, will appear here soon and be followed by War on Blue Water, War on the Lakes, War on Brown Water, and Epilogue.